much pause in all this. Woo!
Put Scooter on the phone, you bird brain.
What do you do, backflips? You jump up there in a silly suit? What do you do?
Yo, bam! I want you to play that.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's 3 o'clock, time to rock. Fast Freddie here, and we got a good show coming up here today on our podcast. My guest this afternoon is Youngstown historian and author Sean Posey. Sean has a book out. Actually, he's got 2 books out. He's working on his third, and one of his books is called Lost Youngstown, and it's uncovering the haunted beauty and rare history of the Mahoning Valley, Steel Valley ruins. And Sean, welcome to the show. Very interesting book, by the way. I enjoyed it. Some great pictures in there, and let's get things rolling this afternoon.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad you can come down, and one of the reasons I was excited to get you on the show is because I really love the history of Youngstown. And first of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the projects that you worked on, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. I'm a freelance writer, teacher, sometimes author. As you mentioned, I'm also a local historian. So I'm working on my third book. My first book was Lost Youngstown, as you mentioned in the intro. The second book I did was on the theater culture of the Mahoning Valley, historic theaters of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley. So Trumbull County, Mahoning County, going all the way back to the first stage theater. So not just movies, vaudeville, things of that nature, going all the way up into, the 1970s and the 1980s.
And then the third book you're working on?
The third book's going to be like an anthology of essays about Valley history. Everything from the very early steel strikes in the beginning of the 20th century to, I have a chapter on the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, during the 1930s and all the things they built. And then into more recent years with chapters on things like the early years of the Southern Park Mall.
Oh, that'll be very good. Early years of the Southern Park Mall. You think about that. You think about the Southern Park Mall, and it's hard for some people to imagine it never being there. And there's still some people around that can remember, like, oh, I remember what that was. I remember when it was a field, and that's kind of crazy because some of these things you see all the time, you take for granted, and you think, wow. You don't even really give it a second thought about the significance or what was there before. And when I was reading your book, one of the things that I thought of as I was out here driving down the other day, and it never really dawned on me, but even something like the Market Street Bridge, as to what the construction of the Market Street Bridge meant at that time. You look at it now, oh, okay, it's the Market Street Bridge. But even if you would comment on that, like what did the Market Street Bridge mean to the development of Youngstown?
Yeah, very few people would give it any thought now, as you mentioned it. But before the Market Street Bridge, or the Market Street Viaduct, as they called it, was built in 1899, the south side of the city was like basically unreachable. There was a small bridge around Oak Hill that you could go over. There was a very primitive bridge that you had to go down. You basically had to go down to the Mahoning River to the bottom and then go out the other side. It was basically impossible to move men and materials to the south side. So for years, the south side was just farms, a few houses, a few fields. After they built the Market Street Bridge, within 15 years, the south side starts to blow up. The South High School gets built. All kinds of churches relocate over there. All of a sudden, the south side, within about 30 years of the bridge getting built, that's where the most people live. In fact, at one time, 70,000 people lived on the south side of the city, which is more people than live in the entire city today.
That's crazy. And it's all because of the construction of a bridge. Now, today we would never look at the construction of a bridge as like a big deal, but that just opened up so much development for the city. And, nowadays we think about a bridge, we would never think of, boy, that's what we needed, a bridge to get this thing going. Right. I think that's wild. And so now you have the Market Street Bridge, and that led to the development of the Uptown. And I know you talk a lot about the Uptown in your book, and the Uptown, it means a lot to me because, being, born and raised on the South Side, I mean, the Uptown was like the main thing ever since I was a little kid all the way up until, man, I mean, I was playing at bars up until, I don't know, maybe in the 1990s on Market Street. So from the time I was a little kid getting my first pair of shoes, or, you know, my family going to get shoes on Market Street, to, you know, playing in clubs and stuff, the whole uptown area was just always a part of my life, and it was just so unique. And I know you write about that in your book.
Yeah, I did. You know, I couldn't find another Youngstown book that had really touched very deeply on the uptown. That's why I wanted to cover it. And for the longest time, downtown was where literally everything that you probably needed was: a lawyer, a dentist, place to buy a shirt, a restaurant. It was all down there. And when the uptown, right around the 1920s and the 1930s, when the uptown gets developed, that's the beginning of this big transfer from everything being downtown to everything gradually moving out. And of course, eventually the uptown itself kind of gets left behind by the malls and Boardman and Austintown and all the plazas that get built.
Yeah. Now, when I was growing up, I could remember that. Well, first of all, one of the biggest things about the Market Street Bridge is that people remember the Market Street robot, and there was a big Amoco sign on Market Street right at the beginning of the uptown. And then when you look down the bridge from, you know, Wick Avenue here on the other side of downtown, it looked like a big robot going up there. Right. And everybody from back in the day remembered the Market Street robot. But then once you started going up Market Street, I mean, that was the place where you had banks, you had fancy restaurants where people would go with a suit and tie. You had all the car dealers were up there, grocery stores. You know, you had a bottling plant there for RC, and then you just had these lines of every kind of store. You know, you had Stambaugh Thompson's, and you had drug stores and grocery stores and the A&P, and you know, I just remember all that stuff. And back when I was really young, I can remember how it was like, you know, like scenes from the movie American Graffiti, because all the hot rodders would be cruising up and down, and all these different clubs and bars were jamming, and it was just a crazy time. All the car dealers were on Market Street, and it was just that strip from like the Market Street Bridge up to Midlothian that just was so jam-packed with all different kinds of things. And you look at it today, and I think the older people that remember what it looked like, it's really a bummer that you look at this and go, man, I remember. Well, talk about some of the restaurants and things that you wrote about in your book that were really big in the uptown.
So going way back, I mean, even to the 1920s, there was of course, one of the few theater buildings that are still standing in the whole Mahoning Valley is still there, the Uptown Theater. Of course, the Uptown is long closed, but that was there from the mid 1920s onward. There was even completely today forgotten theaters like the Market Street Theater and the Ohio Theater. In fact, during World War II, the Youngstown Playhouse was on Market Street. Even for
really?
A while. Yeah, in an old theater building, an old Nickelodeon movie theater building. So that's going way back. And then by, you know, the 50s, 60s, you have Sears opens up in the Uptown. That was a really, really big thing. They opened up a big Sears there. That was like huge, that there was a Sears that wasn't downtown. And it opens around the time that they closed the Sears downtown. So that was a huge deal. You had two of probably the nicest restaurants in the city, maybe in the whole valley. The Colonial House, which was literally like an old colonial house that was turned into a restaurant. It was probably a house somebody lived in the early 1900s when very few people were in the South Side. And then the Mansion, which was another old house that was turned into a restaurant. And those were, you know, 5-star restaurants. Really.
Oh, right. And like I said, when you would see people going out to dinner, I mean, that'd be, you know, women would have a mink stole on, and the guys would have their suits, and people were dressed to the nines, man. I mean, it was a big deal.
Yeah, it was. You know, it's hard to think about now because everything's so casual. Yeah, it was a huge deal to go out to a movie, to go out to eat. It's a very big deal. There was a certain amount of etiquette involved. You know, there was something that was really special about it. To go out, you just weren't going out. You were going out to places that were really pretty classy joints. You know, there was no. I mean, there kind of was, but not like there is now. Everything wasn't fast casual, which is basically what everything is now,
right?
Or just fast food. But before that, even before before fast food existed, these were the type of places that people went out to for, an engagement or prom or just like a nice weekend on the town.
Right. It was a big deal to go to a fancy restaurant like that, and you had them right there on Market Street. Yeah, I can still remember like the block right around Indianola because we shopped there so much. And I think they had a Gray's Drug Store, and they had an Isley's, and they had a Woolworths, and they had a Lustick's, and they had Ducey Music. And then I think at one point after that, I think they had was it maybe the Beachcomber? It was like a disco in there, but that was later years. And they had the Smith's Junior Boot Shop, where they sold shoes, and we would always go in there and get our shoes when we were little. Then on the other side of the street, you had the Mansion, I think, and the Chez Prairie, which had a classic Youngstown sign with the Eiffel Tower.
Right.
And then you had Stambaugh Thompson's, and Mr. Wheeler's was there, and you had all these different things. Then you had Grant's, and then of course you had a lot of different nightclubs in there. Probably one of the most famous was Mickey's. A lot of bands would play at Mickey's. Tell us a little bit about the history of that one.
Yeah, Mickey's is interesting. Mickey's, from what I discovered, actually goes way, way, way back. It started on the west side and then eventually moved over to the south side. But that was going back to like almost the World War II era. So that was there for a really, really long time, though most people today would remember it probably from the 60s and 70s.
Right.
And there were, some people and bands that went on to become really famous played there, like the Human Beings. Was a big one. Maureen McGovern sang there at one time, before she was singing, songs for the Poseidon Adventure and Superman and everything else. So there's some history there too. So yeah, I mean, it was just some other places, the Jam Bar. A lot of people might remember that.
I played there.
The Alcove, places like that. There was a lot of bars, restaurants, theaters, shopping. I mean, it really became like a mini downtown.
Yeah.
That's how I guess you could think of it.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about the Human Beings playing at Mickey's, now see, that's when like my bar days started at Mickey's, but I was like after the Human Beings. But I know a buddy of mine was a cop that worked the door there, and he said like at Mickey's, at that point in time, after they closed down at closing time, the bands that were playing different places would all come up and meet up with the Human Beings, and those guys would jam until 6 o'clock in the morning until they left, and it was just a cool scene. And then then in later years, you had Handsome Dan's Blue Note Cafe, you had the C&R Saloon. They had a lot of national acts play there. Act 3, boy, I played there. We used to have some great times at the Act 3, man. I'll tell you, we had some of the craziest parties that you could even imagine at the Act 3, and it was just like, then they had the Playground was there for a while. They had a place called the Playground, and Left End would play there a lot. And I remember one time Stiv Baders was playing there in a band called Mother Goose. And sometimes Stiv would just go off the deep end. And I don't know what happened that one night we were there. Mother Goose was playing. We stepped outside. We probably had a beer in the car or whatever. We step outside. About 10 minutes later, we come back inside and the band's gone. I guess Stiv did something, and I'm still trying to find out to this day exactly what happened there, but Stiv did something, and they just kicked the band out, and that was the end of the night. But then, another one, you had... what was that? Oh, the Limelighter underneath the car wash. That was another big disco spot. You had the Limelighter, and then you went down the road a little further, and then you had Gabriel's and the Cave. Now, the Cave was a unique place.
Yeah, I have a picture of it in the book, and they basically, when they called it the Cave, they wanted to look like a cave. So there's like these stalactites coming down from the ceiling. They obviously went to a lot of expense to make this look like a really nice, 60s cocktail lounge / bar. That later, it survived into other eras outside into the 70s and 80s. But that was just, I think, give you some example of like the kind of really cool, unique spots that weren't just like, your cookie cutter bar and grills that you might see today, but really, really interesting places where you could go and have a good time.
And crazy signs outside too. I wonder if somebody collected some of these signs, like the sign at the Cave with the caveman was iconic. You looked at that sign sign and you're like, it just stuck in, the Chez Paris with the Eiffel Tower. I think if you were around at that time, you remember that. Or, well, the Pink Elephant out in Austintown. I was lucky enough to get at least a picture of that sign before they took it down. But I'm trying to think of some others. Do you have any other like iconic signs outside of places that maybe pop into your head?
Yeah, I mean, it was like the era of signage, the classic neon signs and everything. Of course, downtown, everybody wanted to have, because, there was all these places packed in right next to each other. And if you were driving, especially, you wanted a sign that would catch somebody's eye, that you could check out. And that was the big thing. It's not like today where signage kind of feels like it's a secondary thing.
Right.
If that, back then it was a big deal. You wanted to have a big, cool sign, especially like the theaters, these giant blade signs that they have. You see the old pictures of them, and they're like, wow. I mean, those signs were thousands of dollars. I mean, just for a sign. But it was, that's kind of what people expected back then. They expected like an experience.
And now it's probably tough to even get a sign up. There's probably so many zoning regulations and size and what it could look like and what color it has to be and where it could be and how many lights you could have on it. So I'm sure today it's not like back in the day when you had that unique sign or a unique looking building to catch people's attention. And that I think is one thing that's really missing too. You have the same cookie cutter Dollar General type thing, Dollar General, Dunkin' Donuts, kind of, okay, every block, every city, it all looks the same. And I think that Youngstown really had a lot of character as far as architecture goes too, for what we see now. But if you remember back in the day, we had a lot of great architecture. And I know earlier we were talking about the bank building on Market and Midlothian that looked like a ship. The boat bank. And what are some of the other ones that you think of that come to mind that you think, man, the architecture on that building was so unique?
Well, some of them going way back were done by very famous firms or architects. So if anybody remembers the Palace Theater, which is long gone, which was down on Central Square, that was designed by Thomas Lamb, who was one of the preeminent theater architects in the entire world. Daniel Burnham did the Wick Building downtown, and he was, one of the very best known city planners of the era. He did that building. So, when you think about that, or the Warner Theater, which was done by Rapp and Rapp, which was a huge firm in Chicago. That was like a $1.5 million project in 1930.
Man. At
the bottom of the Great Depression, they're spending $1.5 million on a theater building. So, yeah, there's a reason the buildings were beautiful. They were meant to be just stand out and to stand the test of time. And of course, fortunately, some of them are still there, especially, some of the buildings down on the square.
When I come down here to do the podcast, I see some of these buildings in downtown Youngstown, and I look at the courthouse, and I look at the Mahoning Bank building, I look at the Wick building, and I look at these buildings, and I go, man, do we have some nice buildings in this town. The architecture. Well, I think we have the tallest buildings between Cleveland and Pittsburgh are located in Youngstown that are still, I think, the most stories. And we had all these great buildings. And then you think about maybe some of the office buildings that the Mills had, and like right off of Market Street, you had the Republic Steel building. And we just had all these buildings, and these top architects from all over the country were putting these together. And I wonder if there are any architects out here now that could actually design a building like that. If they would, first of all, it would probably be so cost preventive. They want to make sure they keep it as low. But do you think there's architects out there that could really sit there and design like a work of art like that?
Well, not to be too judgmental, but there's a lot of, I guess you would call it like postmodern architecture that gets built now in like places like Seattle and Chicago. Mm-hmm. Where I kind of call them like puzzling buildings, where you like walk by them and the buildings are, a very amorphous shape, and they're real. They're supposed to kind of confuse you and look like a piece of art. But you look at them and you say, that might have cost millions of dollars, and maybe a top architect in the world like Frank Gehry did it. But to me, it's nowhere near as beautiful as, say, something like the Empire State Building. That was done in an older, more classical style. I know obviously that's an opinion, but yeah, you don't see a lot of these old like Art Deco era type buildings made it all anymore. You know, the architecture is just like totally different.
That's why I love New York City. The architecture alone. I think some people like it for the food, and some people like it for this, or go to Broadway to see a play, or go to a concert, go to a sporting event, Yankee Stadium. But I really enjoy looking at old architecture.
Sure.
I think I look at it as a work of art. I really do. I think it's a work of art. I'll tell you another nice city too that reminds me of Youngstown, and they have so many cool buildings in decay. As I was just up in Detroit a couple weeks ago, and I go through Detroit, and you look at some of those buildings, and you think about them in their glory days and their splendor, and you're like, man. And you look at these buildings, and you go, who designed that, and how did they build that? I just really get into that. Now, on your Lost Youngstown cover, you have a pretty good picture here of downtown Youngstown, and it looks so good. You had the Paramount Theater there, and we were talking about the advertising, and you look at some of these stores like Learners, and they had a facade that looked really fancy, and then they have big letters that lit up, and right next door you got Richmond's and Lustig's, and it was just so there was just so much more to it than just a sign that says like Dollar General. I hate to pick on Dollar General, but to me, like Dunkin' Donuts, Dollar General, and I go to Dunkin' Donuts and I go to Dollar General, but it's just like the epitome of blandness. It's just like a yellow sign and a building that was put up with 4 walls, and have at it.
Even if you go like back to the 60s when they put up the first Arby's, people may or may not know the first Arby's in Boardman. If you look at the pictures of that, even for like a fast food place, that was really kind of beautiful little building. And now, who goes past a fast food joint and says, wow, that's beautiful? Nobody.
Yeah, I can remember the first time I went there, and you walked in, and the way the building was, and it had that like Western feel to it,
right,
and the wood grain, and you had the big roast beef on the chain sitting there sweating as it's going around, and then you had the giant hat sign with the lights that went around and everything, and you walked in there, and it was like, okay, it was an experience, not just okay, here it is, and it says Arby's, and we got the meats, and that's it. I really do miss those days, and I really miss. I don't know. I must be really getting old. That's all I can think of. But I look at it as more than just, a sign for a building. I see the art in it, and I see the creativity that went into it, and it just seems like that is just lacking so much today.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, even way up into the 1970s when the Southern Park Mall gets built, if you look at some of the old postcards with the giant fountains and all the greenery, they made it look like you were almost in some sort of like, beautiful outdoor environment. Yeah. I mean, malls are not like that anymore. No mall is really. But even in that era, that they were still kind of wedded to the old idea that, well, people want an experience when they go out. So we've got to make these malls look really like, leave people in awe. They're just not here to like buy a sweatshirt,
Right.
They want to see something really cool and unique while they're here.
Right, it's like everything else. Like you go to a ball game or something, you want that stadium, so-called stadium experience. You want a little bit more than, okay, I'm going to run into the store and grab something and get in the car and leave.
Sure.
But yeah, that's pretty wild. Oh, let's go back a little bit. We were talking about how some of the clubs in Youngstown were just like, unique and had their own feel. I think one of the most unique ones was the Merry-Go-Round Club. Tell me a little bit about that one.
Oh yeah, people do bring that up a lot. That's an older one. This was way out on the Salt Springs on the west side. The Club Merry-Go-Round was it was called the Merry-Go-Round because it was kind of like a beautiful old school like bar / supper club. But they had this bar that literally you would sit at the bar, and while you were drinking, every maybe 5, 10, or 15 minutes, it would rotate a little bit. And then if you sat there long enough, you'd make a few rotations. But it was also a place where like national acts like Tony Bennett and Ella Fitzgerald played there, which is kind of wild to think about people like that coming and playing on the West Side. That'd be like if Beyonce came to some bar on Mahoning Avenue today and played. Yeah. It was a big deal, and once again, people got dressed up, and it was a really big thing. It wasn't just like a local supper club. It was like a 5-star establishment.
Oh yeah, it was a big deal. And then they had the stage, the band shell was a seashell. They had a giant seashell. Now think about that. They had a giant seashell on the stage and all kind of stuff hanging down, and then you had the bar that was rotating as you're sitting there, and Tony Bennett playing.
I know,
on the west side of Youngstown, on Salt Springs Road.
Yeah, and people probably didn't think much of it. It was just like, okay, there's places like this you can go to, but now it seems pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, oh, that's nuts. And then you posted something not too long ago that had just an overwhelming response. Ella Fitzgerald got married in Youngstown.
Yeah, she did. Ella Fitzgerald actually played here bunch of times. She played at the Club Merry-Go-Round, as I mentioned. She played at the Elms Ballroom a few times. And she apparently was traveling with the band at the time, and one of the guys in it, Ray Brown, who was a jazz musician from Pittsburgh, they struck up a romance, and then at one point, for whatever reason, they got married when they were here in town. I guess they were, playing a show and they were in a layover. And if you it's online now. If you look at the wedding certificate, Ella Fitzgerald lists her address as North Avenue in Youngstown, which is down over by where West Rayon is.
Right.
So she was probably, a place she was staying for a while she was out on the road. But yeah, it's kind of extraordinary. And a lot of people still don't know about it. And it just got, a massive amount of interest because she was one of the biggest singers of the era.
I don't know which way I want to go here. I don't know if I want to talk more about the movie theaters, but I also want to talk about the music scene, because Youngstown, people our age, we think that, we really had the music scene going with, the Tomorrow Club, and the people before us thought it was going with the Human Beings and all that kind of stuff, and the different teen dances and everything, and all the great bands that really got signed out of Youngstown and stuff. But it seems like the music scene in Youngstown goes way back. I think maybe our love for music and live music and big name acts probably goes back to our grandparents. We probably take it back a step or two. And you had mentioned the Elms Ballroom. Now that place was legendary, and that kind of progressed throughout time as the music changed. So why don't you give us a little bit about the Elms Ballroom?
Yeah, that goes back. It was built in the 1920s as a dance studio, so it was operated as a private.
And
dance
first
studio.
we should say it was on Elm Street, on the north side of Youngstown, and probably where Kilcawley Center sits now, because Elm Street used to just go straight up until they built the university. So this place got the boot when the university got built. Right.
So if you go and walk in the middle of the university now, back in the 1920s when the Elms Ballroom built, that was a neighborhood. There was no, university buildings there or anything. That was just a neighborhood. And they built this huge, beautiful ballroom. I think it was like $50,000 or $100,000 in 1922.
Think of the money we were spending on building movie theaters and ballrooms and stuff in Youngstown, Ohio during the Depression era. It boggles your mind.
Yeah, and then the people who owned it sold it, and it opened as the Elms Ballroom in 1929. And it was just, from then on, it was just a ballroom where, there was local civic activities and things that happened there, but it was also, just a place to go to see, usually almost exclusively, really big music acts from the very beginning. So the first people to go there would have been the Jazz Age. You would have gone and see the biggest jazz bands around. And then crooners like Frank Sinatra played there. So it was, when I say big names, I mean the very biggest people of the era. Mm-hmm. Artie Shaw, the big bands, during World War II. Luckily, I got to interview, before he died, just maybe a year or two ago, Harry Michel, who was, people remember Harry Michel as a local politician, but he was also, going back to the 1930s, a really big dance guy. Uh-huh. And he went to everywhere, including the clubs. At the time, clubs were also often very racially segregated. Harry would go to black clubs. And typically only a couple of white people would go to what they called black and tan clubs, which were clubs where black and white people were. So he went to all of these places, and he remembers them really well. He remembers the Elms Ballroom. And he really gave me a great view into what nightlife would have been circa 1941. Uh-huh. Which is pretty, so what you said earlier was very correct. Way before the Agora or anything like that, people were going out and dancing at some of these really incredible venues.
And we were getting all these big people in here. Like, we talk about, oh man, we saw Journey when they were just up and coming at the Tomorrow Club, or Alice Cooper was there, or Kiss. And now when you're looking back, it's like, yeah, but we had Frank Sinatra come in, Grandpa had Frank Sinatra come in. And now as the music changed, so did the acts, and the Elms Ballroom kept up with changing and the changes in the musical taste.
Yeah, that's what, same with the Idora Ballroom. So ballrooms, when the height of the ballroom era is like when everybody, if you're like a man or a woman and you didn't know how to dance, that was like a really terrible social faux pas. Like, you were going to have a hard time if you couldn't dance. Knowing how to dance was important. But after World War II, when the big bands disappear, all of a sudden, like, dancing, I mean, people are still dancing, but it changes.
Right.
So in the 50s, around the rock and roll era, places like the Elms Ballroom needed to figure out how to adapt. So they adapted by having rock acts, of course, come, but also doing things like sock hops. And then you see DJs appear, people like Dick Biondi, who would become nationally famous years later, Boots Bell. So they come down and spin records, and kids come out and dance. And all of a sudden they're like, okay, we just adapt the ballroom to this new rock and roll era. And, just keep going like we were before.
Now, who were some of the early rock bands that were playing? Because the DJs would spin in between the sets of the bands. So is this where, who were like some of the big bands that were the most popular bands that were playing at the Elms Ballroom, probably would that be 62, maybe 60? Yeah.
So you had local acts like the Human Beings, when they first started, played the Elms Ballroom, when they first got going. The Del Reys, some people might remember that name. They were a very popular local rock act. I think most of those guys were from Camel and Struthers. That would have been like 1960, 1961. But also, while those guys are playing there, on other nights, like Jackie Wilson is there, James Brown is there, the biggest R&B and rock acts at the time are playing there too. So you get a little bit of both.
Now, I understand that James Brown played there a lot after reading your book. And what I found out in his book too is an old friend of mine, DJ Frankie Halfacre, Mr. Lucky, they used to go by the name Mr. Lucky, Frankie Halfacre. Now, I worked with him for several years, and I didn't realize he was James Brown's record promoter.
Yeah, a bunch of guys, because I don't know the whole story, but James Brown played here so many times. Frankie Halfacre worked for him. He had two different guys at different times in the James Brown band who were from Youngstown. So there was this James Brown connection. And then in the 1960s, he actually came and played at South High School. He played a benefit concert. And the money was used for, to open small businesses in the inner city. But he just James Brown, who was so huge at that time, just plays a benefit in Youngstown at South High, and then gives the money away to the community. So, yeah, I mean, he was here a whole bunch of times. He played at the Idora Ballroom too. I mean, he was all over the place. And that just kind of shows you, your city has got to have something going on, or James Brown is just not going to be there every other year.
Right. And of course, he's played at Stamp Auditorium.
Right.
And it's just crazy. Like, the Godfather of Soul has this connection to Youngstown. And once again, I go back to when we talk about the Tomorrow Club or whatever. Oh, yeah, man, AC/DC was there. But we've had this history of music for some reason that has just been going way back. And now you mentioned the Idora Park Ballroom, which, we could even talk about the architecture of that, right? That's like a replica of the ballroom at Coney Island, right?
I think that's, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's accurate. And, that goes way, way, way back to the, early part of the 20th
And then the whole scene there is one thing I did know, and I looked this up for whatever reason at one time. I'm pretty sure that the first musical act to play the Idora Park Ballroom was John Philip Sousa, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. Somebody could look that up, but I think I read that at one point, that John Philip Sousa was the first musical act to play the ballroom. And then I guess you could expand on like some of the other bands on how that history, because it kind of parallels what was going on at the time at the Elms Ballroom, or even before that. So this takes it back. Guy Lombardo, I remember, used to play there like the house band. So maybe you could expand a little bit on that part.
Yeah, I mean, that's a believable story, because that would have been the era. John Philip Sousa was like probably the biggest musician of his time as far as mainstream music goes. Of course, there was ragtime and other things, but yeah, that's very believable. So that's how far back the ballroom goes. And of course, going, like the Elms Ballroom, going forward a little bit, you had a lot of jazz acts play there, Count Basie, people like that. I don't know if Glenn Miller ever played there or not. Glenn Miller did play at the Palace Theater, though, during the height of his career. And Glenn Miller was like the Beatles of the era.
Oh, yeah.
Like, he was just huge. So for Glenn Miller to have played here, too. So, yeah, the Idora Ballroom went a lot of the same direction. And then in the 50s, you had other acts come in, Jerry Lewis, people like that play. So it was every bit as a big deal, and it was a little bit bigger than the Elms Ballroom too. It was a really big ballroom. In fact, it was one of the biggest ballrooms in this part of the country.
Yeah.
So that was, a perfect place for a huge act to come and play. And it was beautiful, of course.
And then that followed the different trends. So like after the big bands and that started petering off, then once again, they started the sock hops as well. I think Dan Ryan might have even started them there, if I'm not mistaken. And then Boots and them guys moved in, and it was still the same thing where you had, the human beings who, the human beings were just so big in this area. They were just so huge. Mike Roncone was another one. He used to play some of them gigs and people like that. And so you had them, and then once again the guys from HOT come back out, and Boots Bell, and then have the DJs playing the records in between, and the bands were playing. So then that whole scene just continued on, just like it did at the Elms Ballroom with some of the same players actually. Right,
and then right into the 70s, you had big rock acts coming in, like the Eagles played at Idora in the 1970s. I mean, the Eagles were just even now that was a mega act, super group.
Oh yeah, the Eagles. Well, I could even remember once Hot Days started, and those were some great days because they would always have the teeny bopper, big teeny bopper heartthrob of the time, whether it was the DeFranco family or David Cassidy, Bobby Sherman, those kind of heartthrobs. They would have the teeny bopper thing, but then out on the midway for the people that were getting away from the bubblegum type stuff, then you would have the rock bands, Left End. Left End would just be like head and shoulders above everybody else. And I do have to, plug my buddy Patsy's book, it's called Tenacity, the Left End Story. It's out there. And boy, when you see the story of that band and how they almost made it and they were this close. But anyways, so you had, I can remember being there and seeing bands like, the Raspberries, Joe Walsh, Michael Stanley, all these bands, and they're just playing there on the midway. And it was such a great scene because, people were drinking Boone's Farm wine and 3-2 beer of our age, and they're partying, and the teeny boppers are watching David Cassidy, and everybody's riding the rides and staggering down in the Mill Creek Park or whatever. It was such a great time that so many people, it hit so many people of that era. So when we talk about it a lot, I don't want to sound like, an old guy and just reminisce about the good old days, but there was really some substance to it. It was really something. And as you can see now, and especially with your book, Lost Youngstown, that's what kind of put it all together for me, is when you see that this just didn't start with us, that this goes back several generations, and we've always had this strong appreciation for music and big musical talent here in Youngstown. Do you have any idea of why that might be?
Yeah, sure. Like everything else, the product of it comes from Youngstown in the early 20th century becoming just one of the steel centers of the world. So by around World War I, the 1920s, the biggest steel producing district, they divided them up in districts, was Pittsburgh, but Youngstown was right behind it, which is incredible because steel was just one of the absolute most crucial parts of the economy, any economy during that time period. So that's one, just all the prosperity here, all the jobs. And then B, people talk a lot about the location. So we were halfway between about Pittsburgh and Cleveland, and then about halfway between New York and Chicago. So a lot of bands that were just coming through this area to go to Cleveland, to go to Chicago, go to New York if they're coming in other directions. It just made sense to play a place like Youngstown along the way. So that's, I think, another reason why, transportation, that we get so many big acts coming in.
Yeah, and you would have that circuit. You'd play Detroit and then maybe Toledo and then Cleveland, Youngstown, Pittsburgh, and then maybe Erie and Buffalo, and then you come back and hit the ones you didn't do and just keep going on that circuit and coming back and building your name up.
Right, and that went on, way back into the jazz age, way up into the rock and roll age, so for a long, long time.
Yeah, so our location played a pretty big part in that. And then the people here, though, loved it, though. That's the thing, The people here, music has just been a center part of our lives for so many years. Now, we were talking about, Harry Michelle and the black clubs. Now, what were some of the black clubs that were going on? Where were some of the places that were happening there? Because we talk about these bars on on Uptown and some of these places here and there. Now, what were like some of the black clubs and what was going on in that scene at the time? Yeah,
and some of this will be in my new book, because that was the history I was interested in finding out about. But it was harder you really had to dig. But Harry helped me out a lot. So there was places, one of the big, this is going way, way back, there was actually a cotton club in Youngstown. So there was the Cotton Club in New York, right, that everybody knows about. But most cities tried to have a cotton club because that was just such a huge name. And there was a cotton club downtown on East Federal Street. There was a huge place during the jazz era, during Prohibition. Mm-hmm. There was always trouble there. And then by Harry's age, it got moved out towards what some people might remember the name, the Monkey's Nest neighborhood.
Right.
So it was in that neighborhood. Uh-huh. And it was a black club, but adventurous white people would go play there, especially musicians and stuff like that would go play, and after hours. So that was a big place, a place called the Black and Tan, and the name Black and Tan at that time literally meant a club where it wasn't segregated. Mm-hmm. So white people and black people there, because a lot of clubs for a long time were totally segregated. So if you were black, you couldn't go to a club, but maybe you could play there, if you were a musician, but you couldn't go there to a club. So there was places like that. And the Elms Ballroom was like that. So part of the week it was like a white club, and then part of the week it was a black club. And so typically the black club, it would always be a black act. And one thing I discovered that was kind of fascinating to me was going back 30s, 40s, 50s, the proms were segregated. So, prom is usually like May, right?
Right.
So for the black community, it was June. They had like what was called a June prom. Huh. And it was usually held at the Elms Ballroom. But there was a big-time black promoter named Clarence King in town. And because of that, and because it was segregated, they would get, for people's proms, the biggest names in black entertainment would come and play at the prom. So that was, the downside, of course, was the segregation. The upside was these huge acts would come in and play. And Duke Ellington, for example, played a prom in Youngstown at Stambaugh.
Wow.
And Duke Ellington was just, and this was in the 30s, he was just the biggest. I mean, he was huge, like Michael Jackson in the 80s.
Oh, sure.
So there was a lot of jazz clubs just dotted throughout the city, like hole-in-the-wall places where you could go and just hear like amazing, like maybe a guy who worked at like the Coke plant during the day at Youngstown Sheet Tube, but then at night, they went and got together and played jazz. So there were all these places, and Harry, I think, had been to like all of them, so he filled me in a lot of that, and that was really interesting.
Boy, you're looking back at that. How would you like to take a peek in one of those places now? If you had a time machine, I would love to go to see some of these places and what was going on and what the scene looked like, Yeah,
and, it sounded very much like what was going on in big cities, too, like Chicago, where, the clubs were segregated, but like white artists like Bix Beiderbecke would come out and play with, some of the big black jazz acts at the time. So yeah, to go back in a time machine, you should probably just like knock your socks right off.
I would love to see that.
My uncle, he would have been very young. He went to some of those places in the 60s when it was still kind of the segregation era, early 60s. And then later on, he went out and he lives in California now. He lived in Seattle. He lived in San Francisco. And he's like, He's like, I've been to all those jazz clubs out in San Francisco and Seattle and LA. And he's like, they were no better than the people that you would hear at those black jazz clubs in Youngstown. To give you some idea of how good some of those guys must have been.
There's a little weed smoking going on back in the day before that was the thing,
Back when you were reefer head. Right.
I would have loved to have just peeked in or been a part of that scene just to see what that. It had to be so cool.
It sounded absolutely just amazing.
It would just have to be. It would just have to be.
Well, to give you an example, and I got this from an oral history. There was a guy who the Youngstown YSU did an oral history with him in the 90s when he would have been quite older, and he was the manager of the Cotton Club in the 40s, and he talked about people would come in and play, and then after hours, one night he talked about two people we talked about earlier. The club had closed, but they were still playing. Ella Fitzgerald was in town playing somewhere else, and Tony Bennett was in, and they both came in and sang.
Damn.
At that club, and I'm like, after hours, just hanging out with the people that were there, drinking, just being real chill. And I'm like, man, that would never happen now. Never.
No, that would be like, whoever, Bruce Springsteen and Steven Tyler from Aerosmith stop in the Royal Oaks after,
just chilling with people, having beers, playing till 5 a.m. Yeah, I mean, I thought that by itself was just an incredible story.
That is a crazy story there. That is a crazy story there. Then, of course, if we look out a little farther, Dean Martin got his start singing out at Craig's Beach. First place, there's a plaque out at Craig's Beach.
Craig's Beach
Dean Martin, 17 years old, came out and sang with some orchestra out. And we have such a deep musical history here in this town,
Yeah, in Ohio, just because to give it some perspective, like way back then, I mean, we were kind of right in the center of the industrial heart of North America. So all Ohio cities were booming, thriving. This was an important part of the economy. Today's everybody's moving to the South, but back then the South was a backwater.
Oh yeah.
This is where things were. This is where things were happening. So it was just a different world, as you alluded to.
Yeah. And I miss it. That's why, I'm interested in your books and just Youngstown history, because we had such a rich history. And, even younger people today, they don't realize even like where our studio is here in downtown Youngstown. If you would imagine this place in 1965, 1957, what this place was, with buses and just hundreds of people, thousands of people, and just all sorts of businesses down here. And I think even right in this block, there used to be an A&P down here and a gas station and, a bowling alley over here next to the Y and, all the way from East Federal Street. That was like a world in its own, man, Yeah,
that's another, now that you mention it, there were, and I've talked to some people who are still old enough to remember, there was some really good black clubs out here. The 40 Club, the Cleveland Bar, all like kind of R&B jazz black clubs on East Federal Street, like kind of hole in the wall places, but with just like, must have been an amazing music scene.
That's where the soul comes from.
Right. And if you didn't know about it, you didn't know about it. But if you did, those were places where you could come here, amazing.
I wish I could have checked some of those out. Now we were talking a little bit about the movie theaters. Now you have a whole book about, the theaters, period, besides movie theaters, about the city of Youngstown. Let's jump into that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there, when I was doing Lost Youngstown, there's a little bit of theater history in there, and I had all this research that I didn't use. So I'm like, I could just roll this over into another book. And then when I started digging deeper, I realized, wow, there were so many. Like I was going to put an appendix in the book that listed all the theaters and like when they opened and where they were. But there were, going back to the beginning, the Nickelodeon theaters, there were so many that I'm realizing that's too much. I mean, that would have been a huge project by itself.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that. I thought, there was a few downtown theaters maybe, but there was tons. I mean, the first, as far as historians can tell, the first, like what we would think of as a movie theater, what they called Nickelodeons at the time, actually opened in Pittsburgh. And it was called the Nickelodeon Theater. In 1905. And, Pittsburgh's about, 60 miles away. Like a year later, maybe less than a year later, there are Nickelodeons in Youngstown. So there are theaters here long before there are in other bigger parts of the country. I guess probably because we were so close to Pittsburgh.
Sure.
So by 1910, 1911, there's like maybe a dozen Nickelodeon theaters in downtown Youngstown. At that time, the movies were short and they changed quickly, and the Nickelodeons were open all night long because of the mills and the shifts. So guys might come out and like go see a little short film after they got out of the mill, like in the middle of the night. So even then, there was this kind of cosmopolitan verve down there. And then as time goes on, they start building these bigger, more beautiful theaters, like the downtown theaters that people remember, like the Paramount and the Palace and the Warner and things like that.
State Theater, yeah. Those were the beginning was like the backroom Nickelodeons, and then the next stage was the downtown movie palaces, when people who ran movie theaters, at first movies were like kind of places of ill repute. Like if you were classier, you went to live theater. You didn't go to the movies. Or if you did, you didn't tell anybody that you went. So they started building these beautiful movie palaces to try to say, hey, movies are sophisticated entertainment too. You can come here and it's not a hole in the wall. Yeah. This is a really nice experience. Movies are an okay thing to be into. We got this big fancy building, and you're going to walk up this big staircase, and we have a balcony, and we have a guy that's going to escort you to your seat.
And we have an aquarium, and a smoking room, and all this crazy stuff, wild, like stuff that you would never think about in a theater today.
And then how about the neighborhood theaters? That's downtown. Now, I think everybody's neighborhood had a theater, and some of the crazier ones that I remember the Mahoning Follies, which turned into like an X-rated movie theater. Now that was just like a neighborhood theater, right? And then when things started going downhill, they started showing the pornos. And
that was a typical thing for a lot of neighborhood theaters when television ate into their business. All of a sudden they're like, well, we can, when adult movies came, they're like, well, we'll just do this. And then, if the city didn't shut them down, which it tried to do a lot of the time.
Right. So there was always a battle between those guys, like the Park Burlesque and everything. Oh, let's talk about that. There's probably one of the most famous theaters in Youngstown is the Park Burlesque. Give us a little history about that, because I can remember when I was little, I was over here on Champion Street, and we would come to the YMCA, 7 years old, and they would always have a sandwich board out front with Busty Russell, and you'd always just look over there and go, oh, Busty Russell, And Busty Russell was the queen at that time, a queen of burlesque. And then give us a little bit of background on the Park Burlesque, because that's one of the most famous theaters, I think, in Youngstown.
Yeah, so, burlesque goes way back to the Depression, and it basically kind of morphed out of vaudeville. And what happened was, in the 30s, the first place you have is this place called the Princess Theater, which had been like a legitimate, quote unquote theater that became a burlesque house. So you might go there, and they'd always usually have comedians like first. And then later on, big time comedians that, would come and start their careers playing burlesque first. And then you would sit through that. And then, of course, the real thing were the dancing girls who would come out, and do some acts. And, of course, always the striptease was the big thing. Yeah. And this, the city, even though Youngstown was like a rougher, wide open city, the city was always like, okay, we're going to shut you down for a while because you're showing too much nudity. But a lot of it was wide open. And then eventually the Park Burlesque was originally the Park Theater, which was a legitimate theater. Mm-hmm. In fact, at one time, Teddy Roosevelt spoke there when he was president.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it was a place that had like Shakespeare and stuff like that. And presidents would come through. Taft, when he was president, spoke there too. This is going way back. And then eventually the Park Theater had a big stage, and they had a showing of Oklahoma, and the stage broke because the sets were too big and they couldn't afford to fix it. So the guy that owned a burlesque theater across the street bought it and fixed it up and then renamed it the Park Burlesque. And then from then on, it was, this notorious place where you basically come to see the dancing girls.
I still remember their ads in the Vindicator too.
They have some really good ones.
Everybody had a different name, Candy Cantaloupe or whatever. Right. America's Hoochie Coochie Girl, and just all those kind of crazy. What did they used to bill Busty Russell as? I can't even think of it now. Oh,
one of them was one of her nicknames was America's Dairy Queen, which is a pretty good one. But she had a bunch of them, you know. She was like, as you said, she was one of the most well-known.
Yeah, you know, when Patsy from Left End was here talking about his book, I guess one time she was playing here, and Left End was playing up at the apartment on Midlothian, and they brought Busty up there, and I guess she come up on stage and started flashing everybody and stuff. Now we're going back in 1970, and it's like, oh no, what's she doing up there? But they got a big kick out of hanging with Busty Russell, the Youngstown legend right there.
Yeah. And I don't know, I did dig up some of her history. She had played in a lot of different places, and I don't ultimately know what became of her. But for whatever reason, she played here a lot, and in Canton too. She had played a lot of local places, but I don't know, maybe part of the circuit.
Probably.
This was a big burlesque town. There were a lot of burlesque theaters here, so it really was.
So was it just the park then?
No, it wasn't just a park. One time first you had the Princess Theater, you had the Grand Burlesque, the park, and then some people might remember the Strand Theater, which was on the square, this is going way back. It was a legitimate theater for years. When it closed, some guys bought it and turned it into a burlesque house, which drove the city crazy because it was on Central Square.
Yeah. And
they tried like hell to shut them down. They tried zoning and everything because they did not want. Even the Vindicator, I found an editorial where the Vindicator wrote, "What city in America has a burlesque theater on the Central Plaza?" They're like, this is a disgrace. Right, yeah.
It's us.
Right, they were outraged, but people in Youngstown, they didn't care about stuff like that.
No.
It was that kind of town.
They were flocking down there, man.
It was a wink and a nod. You know?
Well, you were talking about the comedians too. Did you ever see that one clip on YouTube of Richard Pryor talking about being in Youngstown at the Park Burlesque? They didn't want to pay the feature, and he thought he was going to be a badass and go in there with these mobsters and get the money. That is one of the funniest bits that he does. And it's like, Youngstown, Ohio. As soon as he starts off, I was at a burlesque theater in Youngstown, Ohio.
Right. He didn't know it was a mob town, and there's one people you don't want to mess with.
And he had a blank gun. He went in to get the money and start flashing his gun around, and they just start laughing at him, and they're talking about stabbing guys with ice picks and everything.
If a place ends up in a Richard Pryor sketch, there was something memorable about it.
And we got one from Youngstown, that's for sure. Now let's talk a little bit more about the neighborhood theaters too. Probably one of the most famous is the Foster.
Right.
And let's get into a little bit of history of that, because my memory of the Foster, I can still remember in probably first, second grade, a buddy of mine, Glenn Esposito, had his birthday party at the Foster Theater when it was a regular neighborhood movie theater. I mean, the place was so cool. That's another one. The building is so crazy, and the inside is just so, I guess nowadays Art Deco,
Right.
But it wasn't Art Deco at the time. It was just, movie theater. It was of that period. And I can remember we went there and saw a bunch of cartoons. They were in black and white, and there was one about the grasshopper and the ant and a bunch of other things. And then as the years went by, then they started doing the midnight movies where they were showing like Pink Floyd. I think I might have saw Let It Be by the Beatles there one time as a midnight movie. And they were doing things like Clockwork Orange and just those crazy like art type movies at midnight. And then after that, they went to complete, porno, just straight out porno. And the one time for the radio station, it's a long story, but one of the guys made a porno movie, and we did a porno festival out there and stuff. And it was just like off the wall. It was just crazy. And the one thing I remembered at that time, what they had in there, and some historians should say this. I wonder if it's still in there. They had what was called a buddy booth. And the buddy booth was one guy can sit in one booth and watch a movie, and then in the next booth somebody else is, but there was a button you can push and the thing would come down and you can watch your buddy watching the movie. And they had this thing right in the lobby. And
doesn't sound legal, does it?
I'm sitting there saying, to this day, I said, man, we got to get some historians. We got to save this. Maybe the Sex Museum in New York City or something would like the buddy booth. And that's like my later day memory of the Foster Foster, but it started, like I say, in first grade at 6 years old, going there at my buddy's birthday party and winding up with, what the hell is this Buddy Booth that they got in here? So give us a little history about the Foster. That's my history of the Foster.
Yeah, it became known as, eventually a really notorious place. But, it started out, this guy, interestingly enough, it was the first neighborhood theater in the Glenwood area over there. But the guy who opened it, Joe Chagrin, he had a twin brother who was worked out in Hollywood. They both knew the Warner Brothers well. That's how far back they went, because the Warner Brothers got their start here in Youngstown. And Chagrin knew a lot of people. He had worked out in Broadway, and he knew a lot of stars. So he was clued into the entertainment world. And when he came back here, he opened this theater. So it was like considered a very, very top of the line neighborhood theater. Mostly, think 30s, 40s, 50s, family oriented stuff, serials, Flash Gordon, probably stuff like that. And then, as you mentioned, the 60s, they tried to do the art house thing for a while. And then when times were tough, then they eventually thought, oh, well, we can be this adult theater thing. And then, it was adult theater for like 40 odd years, a long time.
Yeah.
Way after adult theaters had mostly disappeared. It gave way to VCRs and the internet. It was still there. But the building, it's it's a historical building now, and hopefully it can be saved and repurposed, because it's still, the inside is very nice, and
you look at that marquee, and you look at the brickwork in that building, and then when you go inside and you see the architecture in there, and you go up the steps and the bricks, and it's just a really cool place.
Yeah, it was designed to be a really, really top of the line neighborhood theater.
Yeah, I thought I saw somewhere, I just see these things, but I thought I saw somewhere where they said that might be one of the the biggest last remaining single screen sit down movie theaters left in America.
I don't know, of the neighborhood theater variety. That's a good question. I'm not sure about that.
It still has a big screen, single screen, and
right. Yeah. It's very much in the old school mode. And I have not been in the inside, so I haven't seen it. But I guess it's pretty close to what it was.
Yeah.
In its heyday.
Well, I remember one time when I went in there, with the porno thing. And that was probably one of the darkest movie theaters I had ever seen. It was so creepy because it's like, it was so dark in there. It's like, man, there could be somebody sitting next to you.
Right.
I don't know how they got it that dark in that place, but man.
They put some work into it, making it that dark, I'm sure.
I'm trying to think of some other movie theaters that I remember that I can remember me and my dad going to see The Sound of Music, and maybe Fiddler on the Roof at the Wilmington in Girard.
Oh,
Wellman,
the Wellman. Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, Peter Wellman, was he was a Greek immigrant who had came here, and he had two theaters in Girard. But at one time, I think during the 40s, it would have been, Wellman had like 15 theaters in this county.
Oh, really?
And in Trumbull County. And then he had some in Pennsylvania. He was like kind of a theater entrepreneur of this region. He had a whole bunch of theaters that he was running, and he was a really well-known guy. He even had he started a golf tournament here. He would bring in professional golfers. So he was he was kind of an important figure of his time in the business community, and certainly in the entertainment community, and people of a certain age will remember him well. I think there's even a street named after him in Girard, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there probably is. Then let's see. I'm just going to shoot my memories out, and then you could comment on there. Of course, I remember going to the Paramount with my dad again to see, I think it might have been James Bond Thunderbolt there, or Where Eagles Dared, one of those two. And the Paramount was just a fantastic theater. It was just so fancy.
And that was an old theater. That was the first of the big theaters they built. That was like in World War I when they built that. So that was a really old theater. But as you said, a really, really beautiful theater. And it was the last downtown theater that was still a theater when it closed, which is like in 75 or 76. So it was, at the end, they were just showing like blaxploitation films. That was like the last, the last gasp of the Paramount. But it was really, a gorgeous theater. And right before they tore it down about 6 or 7 years ago, it was open, and I went in there, actually photographed.
Oh, you got some in your book.
Yeah, and even in its ruined state, you could see how gorgeous it was. I mean, really a beautiful theater that they obviously spent a lot of money on.
Yeah, once again, and you look at that, and you see the arches and the woodwork and the balcony
and a big organ, of course, because all those theaters, had to have an organ in them.
And even the seats, like here, I think this is the Lady Liberty was on the seats and that sort of thing. The woodwork on the seats, and it was just something else. And you look at here. Oh, here you got a picture. Okay, well, you say it started out as the Liberty Theater and then became the Paramount in 1929. But you look at all the buildings around there and how it looked in downtown Youngstown and McKelvey's and the big marquee and the big sign. It was just so cool. And you picture that big sign lit up that had the name of the theater, and then all the lights going on underneath the marquee. And to walk into a movie theater back at that time, though, it was an experience. And like you say, the change from the backroom Nickelodeon lowbrow into like, wow, look at this. You walked in there, you almost thought you were walking down the red carpet to go see a movie.
Right. If you go to see a movie now, well, I mean, I don't even know if the theaters are open now, but you go to Tinseltown, or what's the other big one?
Oh, yeah.
People will know what I'm talking to.
Yeah.
There's a couple of different big chains, but really they're kind of all look pretty close to being the same. But back then, individual theaters had personality. They were built at different times. They were designed in different architectural styles. They were designed with their own stamp on them. So it was really, the Paramount was not like the State Theater, which was not like the Warner Theater, was not like the Palace. They all had their own personality. And they all had, they were all really beautiful creations too. So much, much different than what came before them, and much, much different than what we have now.
Right. Now, what I'm thinking, let's see, on Mahoning Avenue, you had the Shenley, right? The Shenley Theater, that was right next to West Side Bowl, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, the Mahoning Theater was there too.
Yeah. I still remember, though, how unique the Mahoning Follies looked, too. Like their box office and everything, the way it was set up, it was just something unique. You looked at it and it was like, oh, okay. Like you said, it had that character, and you looked at it and it wasn't the same as the one up the street. Everything was different.
And it was just a neighborhood theater. Even the neighborhood theaters, had their own personality. And
then probably one of the most famous in the building that I liked the most, and I felt, really bummed out when they tore it down, was the Newport Theater. They tore that thing down for a Burger King. And I can remember seeing, like, later, I remember seeing the Who, The Kids Are Right There. I can remember seeing that. There's been a few other movies I saw. I can't remember, but that's the one that sticks out the most in my mind. But you looked at that building, too, and it was just so, you rode by there and go, man. And the way the lighting was, and now the lighting, too, played an important part in a lot of these places, right? The way they had the lobby, the stage, everything lit up. So, maybe
there was thought put into everything, the signage, the lighting outside, the lobbies were always a big deal, and especially the further back you go, it was all, and the Newport had, interesting touches to it, like little murals on the wall that only showed up when the lights went down, so just cool little touches like that, you wouldn't see in a movie theater today. And then, of course, the bigger the theater, like the Warner Theater, of course, that was a huge deal. They brought in woods from Africa and Italy. They brought in sculptors to come in from, all over Europe to do the inside of the building. I mean, that was just as nice as any theater in any city in the country. I mean, a really, really beautiful theater. Of course, you can go there today, and it still looks pretty close to what it did originally. So that's one place where you can go to Powers Auditorium, it's now called, and get a pretty good idea of what it would have been like in the 30s.
And think about that, though. You had those lined up all the way down Federal Street. You had them lined up all the way down the street.
It was just one of many, going from West Federal Street all the way to the East End, down there. There was I even talk about some of the smaller, lesser known places like the Regent Theater, which was an old Nickelodeon theater that survived somehow, I think, because it was a Nickelodeon theater. And then eventually it became like the Black Theater, during the segregation era, like black people could go there, and they showed black films, which they called race films at the time. Okay. With colored casts, that was the thing.
Right.
And so that was, kind of an old, like a little world unto itself way out there on East Federal Street. And that was there for decades, until urban renewal knocked it out of there.
Yeah, they just cleared out this whole everything from practically the YMCA all the way down to the bridge.
Yeah, if you see an old photo of East Federal Street, you're like, oh my God, like it was just like
even the area over here by the Covelli Center and back by where the electric company was, and all the stuff that was in there, and gas stations and tire stores, and
sure.
I mean, you name it. It was just jam packed. When you were in downtown Youngstown, you might as well have been in downtown Cleveland or wherever else, because
sure.
It was that jam packed with just so many different stores and different businesses, and the signs painted on the buildings, and it was definitely something to see. Let's see, I'm trying to think of some other theaters. The Newport was awesome. Oh, we didn't talk about the Uptown. The Uptown is it's good to see that that's still standing. I hope they don't tear that down, and maybe somebody somewhere along the line can preserve that or do something with it. It'd be a shame to see that one go.
There's a guy who owns it. Actually, that's how I have a couple photos of the inside from a few years ago, who let me in, and I don't know what he's doing with it. Recently they actually took off the in the 60s they redid the facade, and they put up like a 60s era sign and like a little almost like a screen or something. They took all that down, so now you can see the facade as it would have been in the 1920s, because above it there's apartments. Now you can see the apartments. They used to be obscured by a sign, and you can see some of the architecture. You can see how old it really is. It's almost 100 years old now. But yeah, that was that opened when the Uptown was just starting. It was just starting to get moving. So that would have been like a far out, like the edge of town. Yeah, way out there. But it was, it had a little balcony in it, and it became known for like showing double features and things like that. And it was, it was kind of conveniently located because there was all those restaurants around there. So you could go out to like the Colonial House or something, and then you could go to the Uptown and just, park, or even take the bus in or whatever. And just the whole area was very walkable, because as you mentioned, Neil, there was just businesses and everything all over the place. And that, that went right through the 1980s. And then after it closed as a theater, most people will probably remember that the Easy Street took it over. So like Pump Boys and Dinettes and all the well-known Easy Street shows that they did, they all started there well into the 90s. That was kind of like, there was a little renaissance there for a while when you had the Colonial House was still there, and the Uptown was still there. And you mentioned there were still some clubs that were left in the area, and that's going back pretty recent history. Yeah, I would say 90s. Years,
early 90s. Except some of my later memories of Market Street are a little more hazy than the ones when I was 6 years old. Right. Some of my memories of Market Street when I was 6 years old are clearer than the ones that took place in 1990 or so. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's usually not the way it is. But yeah, so that's going up pretty much. And then, they were the last people to have that theater.
Yeah, it's just crazy. I know I sound like a broken record. I said it a million times during the show so far, but when you look at what it used to be, it was just something else. It was just a great place to live, and so vibrant, and all these unique buildings that were built in the 20s and had these marquees. And I'm even looking at the cover of your book, and just the Paramount Theater in downtown Youngstown, just the facade on that place, and it was almost like a half a block long, and that big famous marquee, and just the stonework and everything that was in the building. And you walk by there, and boy, you go in there to see a movie, and that was really something. What other ones were we? Then of course we probably had some in the plazas that really weren't. I can remember the Lincoln Knowles Plaza had a movie theater, and then they started putting them in the malls. But
Southern Park Mall even had a theater.
Yeah, but they just didn't have the zip or the zing or the class or the pizzazz as these theaters. So out of all these theaters in Youngstown, which one is your favorite? Do you have a favorite, or
the Palace Theater? I think.
Okay.
Because it was obviously this huge, beautiful neoclassical building. As I mentioned earlier, Thomas Lamb did it, who was like one of the biggest theater architects in the world. But then it also had a big, big stage. So when it opened in the 20s, it was like the idea was you show some films and then you show vaudeville, right? Because vaudeville was like the big thing. And if people don't know what vaudeville was, it was like variety acts. So like comedian, maybe followed by a juggler, and they even had these rooms underneath the stage where they had stalls big enough to put an elephant, because sometimes they brought they had a big acts with animals and things in it. And then later on, they had Broadway road shows that would go on the road, like South Pacific or something would play there. And then in the 40s and 50s, it was a place to go see whatever the new big movie is, like a Humphrey Bogart movie. But then, you could see, as I mentioned earlier, like Glenn Miller played there, like big acts played there because it had this huge stage. So it was incredibly gorgeous theater with a big stage. It was like half movie theater, half concert venue, or theater venue. So it was really, just an outstanding building.
Now that was right on the square, right?
Right
on the square.
What today is the parking lot of the Stambaugh Hotel. The hotel that's down.
Okay.
It's hard to picture now, but it would have been there, like dominating that part of the block.
Yeah, my neighbor, she was the cleaning lady there back when I was growing up. All Romanian woman.
Oh man, that must have been interesting.
Mrs. Broomba.
Just being the cleaning lady.
She was she kind of dressed like a gypsy, just that classic old lady. And I think she was still cleaning there when she was 90 years old, and she'd walk down to Poland Avenue and take the bus down there, and had a shopping bag, and she was the cleaning lady down at the Palace
Theater. I remember
Theater.
my dad saying in the, this would have been, he kind of came up in the 50s. He was like, oh, like the Palace Theater, he's like, you could go to like the Newport with like your buddies, but if you went to like the Palace, you went with a date. You didn't go with your buddies, like that was put on your, he would have like tailor-made suits, like literally made from a pattern.
Oh yeah.
And this was when he was in high school, and he gets a tailor-made suit just so he could take his girlfriend out to the Palace Theater, because it was that, it was that big of a deal.
Yeah, he ain't like that anymore.
Oh God, no. Yeah. That sounds like it was a million years ago.
Yeah, that's crazy, man. So, I'm talking a little bit now. Let's move on. You're also an industrial explorer, which I love doing this. This is something, and in your Lost Youngstown book, you have several chapters about, going around to these old factories and just finding old machinery in there. And it is so cool. How did you come about, what is an industrial explorer, and then how did you get your interest into that?
Yeah, it's, maybe it started in the 90s, though there's some photographers that were doing it long before that, but it's just became popular maybe in the last 20 or 25 years. And, here there was a lot of great opportunities for it, because, there were still, when I started doing it, there were still some of the mills there and all these just wide open buildings. And I would just go into them, and I was a photographer. So I'd be like, man, I'm just got to shoot all these places. And I had a couple buddies up in Cleveland, and they would come down here, and there was just a bunch of stuff up in Cleveland. So we used to go on road trips. We'd be like, okay, we're going to go to Detroit for like 3 days and shoot everything. Like just climb through all this stuff in Detroit.
Oh man, I'd love doing that.
Detroit just by itself, there's so much there.
Oh, I know.
Old, the Packard plant is just like half a mile long, abandoned, like a city, like an abandoned city. You could spend all day just going through it. And so we would go all over the place. Buffalo, Philadelphia.
Oh, Buffalo, another great town for that. I could see Buffalo in its heyday. Of course, all this stuff's getting knocked down, but boy, I could see a few years back, man. Wow. Yeah, Buffalo's another one of my favorites.
Yeah, and we would, even Pittsburgh area, a lot of cool stuff in that area. And we would just go all around, and we'd meet people online, and they would know who we are. And we'd be like, oh, yeah, we're coming up, to whatever city you live in, and we go hang out and shoot with them, and it was a lot of fun. And then, of course, I ended up just rolling a lot of the stuff from here into the book, because I had the Paramount and shooting too about all this great stuff. I'm like, man, I got to do something with these photographs.
Right. You couldn't just let that sit. So, I think we're running out of those places though now in Youngstown.
Yes.
It's not like it was, because now everything's just getting this, smashed up and is gone. Even like most recently, like when they closed down, the GE lamp plant here on Market, that might be one of the last ones that was around. There's still some stuff out there. Republic Rubber, Commercial Shearing, I think, or GF still has, where they do the war enacting at one of those every once in a while.
I think it's GF, right?
And it's not like it used used to be when there was just something cool all over the place,
Yeah, I mean,
whether it was a train station, an old railroad building, the Gateway Yard down in Struthers, Camel, Lowville
cool
there.
place.
I mean, there were some really cool places that even when you went in them, you'd still find some cool stuff in there, because a lot of these places, it's amazing that they just left their stuff there. It's like, okay, this place closing down. All right, see ya. Drawers full of stuff and lockers with things in them and calendars posted on bulletin boards and stuff.
Everything. I remember we went through the old Avanti Motors plant that was out there on the east side for a long time, and they left behind the employee records with like people's social security numbers and their addresses. They didn't even take that stuff. Yeah, and like you said, signs. Avanti had like car models. Like models of like, I guess maybe what they were going to do, in a new year. Yeah. And they were just left there. They just left them. They didn't even take that. So didn't even lock the place up. They're like, okay, we're bankrupt. Walk away.
Yeah, I've always found that amazing to a lot of those places that I went, nosing around in. And they just leave everything there. It's just like, okay, see ya. See me, I'd be like taking everything.
Right, yeah.
I'd be taking boxes out of there. But I guess, we look at it one way, and the people that look at it that work there every day are just like, I'm out. I'm pissed. Yeah, you guys going to clean you guys going to file bankruptcy and you got rid of me. Screw you. Screw your stuff. I'm out. See you later. I don't want anything to do with this place.
Right.
Flipping the bird on their way out of the building.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So what was another fun one that you really enjoyed going through?
It was, I'm not sure what part of it is. The buildings are still there. I think it's locked up now. Down on Poland Avenue, part of the old, it must have been part of Republic Steel.
Mm-hmm. That's my old neighborhood right there.
Okay, yeah. Well, you know what I'm talking about then. We went down there and there was just some giant buildings down there, and there was a lot of stuff there. It was LTV at the end, and there was like the offices had like the LTV mugs were still. We took them, of course. They were still there on there. The signage was in there and everything. It was real ghostly. Like the little medical clinic. If you got hurt or whatever, there was still like bandages and stuff in there, like all that stuff. It was, and we were in there once, and it was the summer. And while we were in there, and these mills, I mean, there's just these long, huge sheds.
Yeah.
And there's a storm outside. And the ceiling, part of the ceiling is coming up, and you can hear it banging in the wind. And it was really ghostly to be in there. And just think about
that's crazy.
All the generations of people that went through that building, and here you are now in the middle of the storm in like this just ghostly empty place. And the workers' goggles and their boots are still on the floor and stuff. It's kind of creepy.
Oh, I know. I would love to have gone through that one. That sounded like
was a fine. We were blown away. We were like, man, this is incredible.
And once again, the stuff that these guys leave behind. It was just like, okay, we're out. Give me my lunchbox.
A guy told me that had worked at Sheet and Tube, that when they closed the Camel Works and they came down over the footbridge, that all the guys there had taken their steel-toed boots and just thrown them in the river. I mean, like thousands of guys, like just tossing them over. And I was thinking, man, I wonder if those boots are still at the bottom of the river.
They could
that's a hell of a lot of boots. He's like, we were just so outraged. We were just.
I can imagine what it was like coming out of that day. I know how it was when I got the boot, man. It was just like, devastating, absolutely devastating. And the thing that got me with the steel mills, especially growing up like right there and being around them, it was just because they were so big and they were so massive, and just the thought of how would that close down? How would 20 miles of factories with 7-story tall blast furnaces and everything, how would that possibly close down? That has been a part of our life forever. It's always been here. How would that close down? And then on top of it, how would they tear it down? You mean they would tear that down? I never went to watch them tear down one blast furnace because it just hurt me so much. It's crazy, but I couldn't stand there and watch it. I see some of them pictures and it's like, I can't even look at that because I know what it meant. and being from there and seeing that, and that's an everyday part of your life and your family's lives and relatives that work there, and knowing like the devastation and the heartbreak that those closures cost. I couldn't even stand there to look and see it. Hey, going down or going down, knocking down. It's like, nope, I don't want to be anywhere near that, because it really bothered me that much to see that. Now, getting back to the industrial exploring, did you ever come across some bums in places and stuff?
Especially in Detroit, like everywhere we went, there was people, which was a little unnerving, because in Youngstown, usually you never run into anybody. We were in a place in Detroit called the American Hotel, which was this gorgeous, huge abandoned hotel just sitting there. And this was about 10 years ago when Detroit was just a tomb. Mm-hmm. And we're like in a place that must have been like a bustling part of the city. There's nobody around, nobody anywhere. Which is, you could have like rolled a bowling ball down the street, not in a car. And we go in the building, and we go up to the top, and we go through the middle of it. In the middle is a beautiful old ballroom, gorgeous ballroom, and there's all the chairs are still there. It's like really ghostly. Yeah. And we go up to the top, and we shoot some of the rooms. We come back down, and there's people in the ballroom. This couple sitting there in the chairs, and they're smoking a joint, and they're just like looking at us, and they're like, "Hey man, like, you want to smoke?" And we were just like, no. I mean, it was like two 50-year-old people like just chilling there, and we're like, that you'd run into people like that, because you're in a place, there's nobody there, you don't expect like all of a sudden, oh, there's a bunch of people there. We were in another place where we went into this building, a huge abandoned, I think it was like an automotive facility in Detroit, and we could hear this music, and we got into a certain part of it. And then in one of the subfloors, it must have been some kind of workspace, there was these people having a rave. I mean, the music's blasting, and there's like all these kids, like hundreds of kids. We're like, what the hell are they doing? They're in the middle of this plant, and I guess nobody knew or nobody cared that they were there. Just
cool place to have one.
Out, right?
Why not, man?
Yeah, I mean, there was nobody around, but it was weird to run into. You kind of weren't expecting that.
I remember one time I was over here at over on Valley Street when they still had that one railroad building there, the Valley Tower. Yeah. And I was in there, roaming around and stuff. And it was kind of crazy the way the building was, because, it was a tower. So, but the wood part, was on the top, and then the frame or the base was kind of like maybe more than a story of like a brick foundation, and then the tower was on the top. And I went down in that thing, and there was some guy in there. And I was like, I was by myself, Oh,
that's
and I turn around, I go, holy shit, I jump up, and I'm like, oh man, I hope this guy don't pull a gun on me or something, because who even knows? I'm in this thing by myself, which is probably not a good idea to go by yourself, I would think. No,
yeah, I was never brave enough to do that.
And so, but I found all kind of cool stuff in there. But I fortunately, I was thinking real quick, and I turned the tables on him. I was like, what are you doing in here? This is railroad property. You got to get out of here.
There you go.
Okay, man. Just down here. Yeah, you got to get out of here. This is, if you don't have a pass or anything, you got to get out. And so he kind of strolled away. And it was like, I was like, whew.
Right. Probably just some, random guy, but you never know. I mean, like,
oh yeah, these days, especially like I say, okay, you're in this old abandoned railroad building down here on Valley Street with nothing else around, and you're sitting in the basement.
You're there by yourself, right?
Yeah,
that's creepy.
And this guy could do something, hop on a train, and be long gone.
Nobody would ever know.
He's in Buffalo or something the next day, and it was like, okay, how would we ever track this guy down? How would we ever find him? But yeah, the urban exploring, I really love it, man. I just think it's really cool. You know what? One thing I noticed. Now, this was the first time in ages that a presidential candidate didn't visit Youngstown in years. And you know what my theory is? It's because they came here just to use all these factories and stuff for backdrops, and not really because they cared about us. That's my opinion anyways, because now they don't have a blast furnace to stand in front of. They don't have an empty, they don't have the GE plant here to stand in front of. It seems like we took all their props away, and now they didn't show up. And that, I don't know if I'm right or wrong about that, but a lot of people are saying, well, how come nobody showed up? And I was like, you know why? Because there's nothing for them to stand in front of to make their big speech.
Well, that was the thing to do, wasn't it? It was like every presidential candidate, at least after the steel era, you'd have to come here and stand in front of a mill and, give your spiel. That was the thing. I think they probably were like, okay, we're going to Youngstown. Like, find a really messed up looking building and we'll do our little
and then we could do our trade policy or whatever and make sure it's rusted, make sure it's fallen down. And I think they did that. Now there's still some in Warren. Now even in Warren though, they knocked down the GE plant and some of those, but there's still a few that I checked out a couple years ago, and I think there's still a few standing. And it was like that, like one of the Delphi plants, like the control board for everything is sitting there and all the garage door openers, and it's just amazing on how they just say, okay, adios.
I think Copper Weld is still out there, like the whole facility, I believe. I haven't been there, but I think it's all, and that was a big place. I
rode by there on the bypass the other day. It looks like there's different pieces and parts missing.
Oh, I see. Maybe they're taking some of it down.
They are. It seems like they're taking some stuff down, but that's still a good one that I think is out there. And another one though that I think they have heavy security is that power plant in Niles.
Oh, that would be a cool one.
That looks bad to the bone. Now I got some pictures because we took a boat down there, and got from behind it, and it was pretty cool. I remember going in there on a tour when it was still operating, and it was really cool. But I think that would be a good one. But I think they have a guard down there and a lot of video surveillance. That's the thing now. Some of these places, they got so much surveillance, and
you can't
the ones that are left that would really be worth it. But I'll tell you, it was pretty cool seeing that from like the riverside and where the water intakes and ladders and big staircases and all that crazy stuff. I just think that stuff is so cool. Now, what are some of the other places you went to in the book?
The old part of Sheet and Tube down by Struthers, which is now, I think they've cleared it all out. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think I have a picture there of the sign when I first went there, and this would have been facing, I guess it would have been facing the river. This was in the Struthers side. There was still a Youngstown Sheet and Tube sign with a couple of letters missing. That must have been God only knows how many decades old. Yeah. And I was like, oh, this is sweet. I crawled through there. I found some good stuff there. I found like time cards from like September, October from 1977, like the last time cards, like a big pile of those, like the goggles and stuff, hard hats. There were still lockers with stuff jammed in them. That was really cool. I mean, because there was so much stuff in there, and then behind it they had a whole bunch of these old train cars, and then some of the big hot metal ladles. Yeah, and all that stuff was just like stacked up in the back, and that was just so cool because that stuff must have been, God only knows how old that was, probably 100 years old maybe.
I kicked myself in the ass that I didn't take more pictures and get out there and do more of that. And also when I was young, I would hang out like on Center Street Bridge. Oh yeah. And watch the trains, and you could just stand there and watch them tap the blast furnaces. It would look like a volcano eruption every so often, and you're standing there looking at it from over the bridge. And I used to think that was the coolest thing. I would go down there all the time just to watch that. And now I think back and I go, man, I was probably about 9, 10, 11 at the time, probably 9, 10 in that range. I mean, just the railroad pictures and the mill pictures and the pictures of the guys and just so much stuff going on. I think, man, if I would have had a camera back then, the stuff that I would have had, I would have been putting out books, Oh yeah. I mean, of course, people think stuff they grow up with is going to be there forever. Like that's just the thing. Like, oh, well, that'll be there forever, and then years later, you're like, oh, nothing's forever. But what's interesting about that is those old open hearth mills that, like what you saw now, like if you took a young person, there's literally nowhere that you can show them that. That's just lost to time. It's just gone. Like steel's not made like that anymore. All that drama and everything, that's just nobody who didn't see it can see it now because it's just over. Yep. You got to watch an old movie or whatever.
Or documentary or something.
Yeah, documentary. But to just stand there, you're 10 years old, little kid, you're just standing there on that Center Street Bridge and just watching this stuff right in front of you, and the sirens and the explosions and the hot metal and the guys in the hot metal suits jabbing in there. And the next thing you know, the slag comes shooting out. And you're just standing there going, man, is this crazy? This is wild.
Yeah, I mean, all the industry out there, even the heavy industry, even like making cars and something, probably steel had to be the most visual thing. Just the huge blast furnaces, the sparks, the fire, the sounds and everything. I mean, it was just those, and the facilities were just so big. I mean, it was just like a little alien world in next to your world, like your regular civilian world. Then there's this alien world of the mills, just right there.
Just those huge ladles pouring hot steel into ingots and things like that. And you see that and you're like, what the heck? And sparks flying and smoke. And
the guys who worked in there, like, man, you had to be some kind of guy, to be able to make it in an environment like that, because that's just...
Oh, it was definitely hard work. There's no two ways about it. Yeah, you hear stories about, I just used to sleep, maybe towards the end, but when the mills were jamming, you were there working. And sometimes I see some of these people be on TV and they'll be talking about how, the economy has changed, but say, hey, we got to get more young people involved in manufacturing. And, and they kind of look down on people like, oh, you don't have to go to college. I remember when I was growing up, there was not one single guy that walked out of that mill and said, hey, you got to get in here when you graduate. There was never one guy out there. Every guy that would walk out of that in Visha's bar or whatever, they'd always say, you better study in school and get a good job. That's the last place that you want to be. Nobody sat there and said, yeah, hey, it's a good paying job. And it was, people were making money, but nobody said that. They were like, you don't want to be in there. Go out and get a better job than that. I never had anybody say, hey, stick around, man, boy, when you graduate, get ready. I'll get you in. It was like, stay the hell away from this place.
Yeah. I mean, that's, of course, at the beginning, when people came over here from Europe or whatever, that's really all they had. And it was, any job where you could survive was good, even though it was
the land of milk and honey. I mean, for what you were making, it was a little easier than digging coal in some of these coal mines that were just put together and no safety things whatsoever. But yeah, so you're right.
But you see like the early mill footage, like from the pre-World War II era, like, dude, there's guys with like hats like mine on and no safety equipment, just like, oh, get the ladle over here, and there's stuff bursting around all around them. And you're like, oh man, those guys were tough. And they worked 12-hour shifts, not 12 hours like at a desk, like 12 hours in the mill. I mean, I can't even imagine how tough those guys were.
Oh, and some of them guys that would work with a hand shovel all day, shoveling stuff all day, coal or whatever they had to shovel. There was a lot of people. That was your job, shoveling stuff.
Or working in like the blast furnace at the Coke Works, man, for 30 years. Oh boy.
Oh, and the fumes and the toxic gases.
Yeah, God only knows what they breathed in.
I mean, how many, the steel industry was an industry where you could go to work that day and get killed. You could actually walk into that steel mill and not come back out. Something can fall on you from a crane. Something can blow up. You can get crushed between train cars. That's why they used to have those signs out there. So many days since the last accident. And that was a big thing because people would get hurt. People would lose limbs. People would lose their lives. And just for going to work, just for getting out of the bed in the morning. And every day that I remember would be down there by Stop 5 and you'd see an ambulance come pulling out of there and you're just like, oh, I hope that's nobody we know. I hope that's nobody we know. Bless yourself. Oh no. You'd be worried. You would have
your game face on when you went into work because that was just like, man, that was no joke.
And then, well, like you say, coming up in your next book, you're going to talk a little bit about the labor strife and that sort of thing. So you're dealing with some tough people to begin with. You're talking about, and I think this kind of forged Youngstown's mentality, why we have boxers, why we have football players, why we're this gritty city. I mean, we had some badass guys, because this is what they were doing for a living. And then if you were the company, you weren't going to push them around because they were going to push you back, because these were just some tough cookies.
Yeah, I mean, those early steelworkers had to be just the toughest. I mean, well, when the book comes out, probably come out at the end of this year, you'll see, because when there was a strike, I mean, later on, like in your era, Meyer, there's a strike, guys that come out and drink coffee and hold up signs. When there was a strike back then, the company brought in guys to like kill you or beat the crap out of you. And these strikers, like, okay, we're going on strike. We're getting guns. We're getting weapons. Like, there's going to be like knockdown, drag out brawls. I mean, this was serious business. People got killed.
Oh yeah. Well, in the Little Steel strike, my great grandfather was on the picket line down there in Stop 5 when it hit the fan down there, and in the report in the New Yorker that they wrote about that, in the whole piece they wrote about the New Yorker, it mentions Powersdale. That's where we lived, and it's talking about on Powersdale. And one of the things my mom always talked about is she was a young girl at the time, and she was injured in the kitchen as a little kid. There was some water boiling on the stove, and the pot spilled or something. She burned her leg, and she still remembers to this day that they brought one of the doctors from the picket line to come up and take care of her, to come and take care of her burn.
Yeah, that was a rough strike. Up until World War II, when finally, the government forces companies to recognize unions. Then it gets better after that. But before that, it was just like the Wild West. And of course, in the auto industry too, if there's a strike, man, like, you didn't know if the government was going to bring out federal troops to shoot you, or the company was going to hire Pinkertons to, burn your house down. Yeah. I mean, it was, and like you said, those guys were tough, man.
And they didn't back down. They went and got a gun or a axe handle or a baseball bat, and they weren't afraid to bust people's heads.
Well, if you worked in one of those mills all day long, you sure as hell weren't afraid of some private detective agency.
I think so.
You weren't going to let somebody like that push you around if you were going to survive the mills.
Oh, yeah. Because there were some strong guys back then. Them guys were tough, and a lot of them railroad guys too that like worked on rail cars and stuff and were lifting heavy things. There were some of them guys there you wouldn't want to mess with. And then everybody was a heavy drinker back then at that time too. So now you got these guys that are badasses and heavy drinkers, and the last thing they want you is you're going to go push them around.
In my new book, I have a chapter on the 1919 steel strike, which was like the biggest steel strike at the time in the industry, and it was really big and violent. And he was talking about how tough people were. And this was down by Stop 5. There was some police force down there. Some of them were private police, some of them were Youngstown cops, and these women, these immigrant, wives from, some of them who could barely speak English, came out and attacked these guards and were like beating them with brick bats. They had they made these concoctions of all these different spices they used in their exit dishes, and they threw them in their eyes. And these cops were like afraid of these women.
Oh, wow.
They're like, they're like, call for backup, get tear gas. And these were women, who were beating the crap out of them. So that's how tough these people were.
All right. Youngstown, Ohio. Why do we have so many boxing champions? Why do we have so many football players come from this area? Because it's in our history. Right. We have this history of tough people. Although I don't think people are like that anymore. I think that's kind of fading as years go around. I think it's at a point now that the man is keeping us down. We don't really have the leverage even as workers as we used to have back then. True. Now it's like, okay, you go on strike, we'll shut the plant down, you're out, and we're going to move to wherever, and we'll move to China, they'll do your job for free. It's like we don't have that leverage. Before,
you're very right.
when we were the steel leaders, the only place you were going to get it anywhere in the world was in Youngstown. So if these guys demanded this, if the price went up, you needed it, so it didn't really matter.
Right. Nobody in China was like, why would you put anything in China?
Who was really competing against us? Not many people. If you wanted it, you had to get it from us, and this is the price. And nowadays, it's just not like that. Some people are anti-union. I think unions have a good purpose if they do it right, not just make the guys at the top rich, and
Sure.
you know, the guys from the union are golfing with the guys from the company, and they're all in it, or they maybe keep too many jackasses around that should be gone, things like that. But I think when they were negotiating for a lot of things, you know, when we look back, you know, to safety and, you know, fair wage, safe working
Basic
conditions, things along those lines, I think they played a good part. But it's like nowadays, it's just it's like they don't have the clout to pull things off. You strike, they'll shut down the company, and we're gone. You know, you give us a hard time, you're fired. See you later. And I think it's a whole different world now.
Yeah, there's a few, you know, like, I mean, now, like, the unions really have some leverage, or like a teacher's union, you know, or the nurses, you know, not very many. Manufacturing workers, almost none, because so much of it has already been shipped away. I mean, you know, the United Steelworkers, United Auto Workers are not, you know, the force that they were back in the day, where they could, you know, shut the whole country down if they wanted
Teamsters back in the day, boy, you could just shut the whole country down.
Yeah, I mean, the Jimmy Hoffa, man, people were afraid of Jimmy Hoffa because he could just be like, press a button and shut the whole country down.
Well, now that's the one strike I remember, when the Teamsters and Fast shot it out down at Stop 5.
Right.
That had to be maybe, what, 1969, maybe,
Yeah.
68, 69.
And even in that late date, there was still, like, you know, violence going on.
Yeah, you look at Channel 27 or Channel 21. Ed Barron on YouTube has some of his reports from when this whole thing was going down, and you had people hitting people with baseball bats in the head and pulling out guns. I mean, this is right on TV in Youngstown, and the cops are around, and people are shooting, and guys are getting killed. And I mean, they were battling out. That might have been the last big one.
I think it was
the Battle of OK Corral, and I can remember that one because, once again, it's right up the street from, you know, where I grew up. And I remember when that was still going on, like after the dust had settled, I walked down the railroad tracks. I'm up there by the lumber yard on top of the hill on Britain Street, and I'm just like kind of peeking down there. And next thing you know, these two guys from the picket line come up with guns. You know, what are you doing up here? I'm like, 12 years old, you know, I'm 10 years old. What do you guys, you know, and if I had a gun, by the time you guys walked all the way down here, I think I would have shot you first, you know, but it was kind of scary for me. But those guys, you know, they wanted to see what I was doing up there. And, you know, you just saw the whole area, and everybody was down there, and their fires burning, and, you know, people were pissed. And that was crazy. But you haven't seen any real strikes like that ever since.
No, I don't think there's anything like that happens, at least not in this country.
Yeah, that would have to be somewhere else. Well, they're not going to do it in China because they wouldn't stand a chance.
No, you don't want to mess with the Chinese government. I wouldn't want to strike over there.
You would have been done with that.
Just disappear.
Yeah, but boy, that's another interesting part of Youngstown history. The labor unions that, you know, when these guys. You know, we owe a lot to them as far as in our country for some of the changes and safety measures. And
because you really, you know, before unions became big, you just had, people don't know, it's hard to communicate to people now. You had no rights at all. Zip. Like, you didn't have a right to a weekend or overtime pay or a pension or health care. The company could just grind you down and boot you out, and that was it. Or if you complained too loud, they could just, you know.
You were done.
Yeah, so I mean, people fought for those things for a reason, and, you know, they had to fight for them because, you know, nobody was just like, oh, yeah, okay, well, you know, we'll give you a pension. Sure. Yeah, we'll give you a vacation time. No way.
So what else you touching on in this new book without giving everything away? You got
I mentioned,
because this is going to be like, if you just joined us, the new book by Sean Posey is going to be like a series of essays that you've wrote on different topics. So what are some of the other things?
A lot of it is going to be more like what you might call hidden history. So I have a very long chapter on, since we're right down here, the evolution of Central Square, going from 1802, when they laid out the plat, you know, and Central Square was just this little like meadow, all the way until the 21st century. Like how everything down in the middle of downtown changed. And of course, it changed enormously from being like a little swampy area to being like, you know, surrounded by skyscrapers and trolley cars everywhere. And, you know, I go through all that history so people really get a look at what the center of town was like in different eras. And there's a lot of interesting stories in there, and a lot of things that could have been, like how plans they had to change downtown that just never came about. Like putting in a subway system. They wanted to put in a subway system at one time.
No kidding.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give too much away,
Yeah,
but you'll
right.
definitely.
You don't have to read the book.
You'll get a real peek into that.
Those are just things that people don't think about. And I find them fascinating. For some reason, I find the history of Youngstown fascinating because it's so deep. I'm sure there's other places out there, but when you start looking at our history of like even the Warner Brothers and the Good Humor Bar, and you start digging into just the things that people know about, the penalty flag was invented in Youngstown, and there's just so many different connections to the whole world and to the whole country, major connections that started here in Youngstown, and that's why I just find it so fascinating.
Right, and people could go on and write many more books than what there are, and speaking of that, I have another chapter on early baseball history. So the beginning, like even before there's Major League Baseball, like how it starts here in Youngstown, a lot of guys that went on to become big league players that were from this area and the things they did. And some of it people will remember if they're old enough, but a lot of it I think is stuff that people won't have any clue about at all.
Oh, that's a good one. That is a good topic right there. That could be a whole book right there.
Oh yeah. There was a bunch of stuff I left out of it, but there's a lot there. Just that, the
baseball history of Youngstown, Ohio. Yeah, you could do a whole book on that when you start looking at the minor leagues and different guys and all the different connections and people that played.
There was a guy, and his name is going to escape me, who did a book just about boxing history.
Yeah, Craig Snyder.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So there you go. Just a book on boxing,
Yeah, I got that one too. And that's another interesting book because he really went through like from the beginning and who this guy fought. And there were so many interesting stories about what happened to some of these guys. Some of these guys got murdered. And you're talking about Ernie Shavers fighting in the Golden Gloves in the day. Everybody knows Ernie Shavers and his fight with Muhammad Ali. But you read this book, and it's this guy from Braceville that was fighting in the Youngstown Golden Gloves against, they tell who he fought against. And there was a lot of interesting stories in there about guys that turned pro, maybe weren't even champions, but fought this guy or fought that guy. And then, I think that book is really good, too. Boy, you could probably do a whole baseball book like that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure you could. And he probably could have done maybe even another book on boxing. That's so big.
Oh, yeah.
And that was, you could do just a book just about, like somebody like Boom Boom.
Oh, yeah.
He's a book right there.
Oh, yeah. There's several books about him and movies. And, that's the thing, too. When you look at some of the characters in Youngstown, Jim Trafficant, how many things have been written about him and documentaries made about Trafficant alone. And, Jim Tressel, even though he's not like a native Youngstowner, but he's got a lot of close ties to the city of Youngstown. And there's a lot of other people out there that are like that you could just go, you know what though? You inspired me, and here's an idea for a book too. I was thinking of this after I read your stuff, and I've been diving into this a little more since it's been on my mind. We need a book about bowling alleys of Youngstown, the history of bowling alleys. Can you imagine that one? If you would really go back to the beginning where they had, pin setters and...
Well, I mentioned briefly in the theater book that the Warner Brothers, when they were getting started, before they realized that their life was going to be in theaters, they had a bowling alley in downtown Youngstown. That was one of their businesses.
Really?
Yeah.
How did I miss that one? So they had a bowling alley.
They had a bowling, they sold ice cream. They had a bowling alley. They had a bicycle shop. Yeah, they tried a bunch of different things before they realized that they were going to jump on the movie thing.
See, those guys are interesting too. That's another one that
totally. It's hard to overestimate how important the Warner Brothers were. I mean, I talk in the theater book just about Sam Warner, just the one brother who started out as running a projector at the Idora Park, showing like early films at Idora Park. And, eventually he's like the driving force behind introducing sound into movies. So he convinces the other Warner Brothers to invest in developing a technology to have what they ended up calling talkies. And that's like biggest revolution in cinema. And here's this guy from Youngstown who was like the force behind pushing them into this new.
How huge is that?
Pictures. Huge.
It's amazingly big, and you see Warner Brothers is still around today. It's such a huge company, and here's this guy messing around with a bowling alley, and what else you say he was dabbling
Bicycle
in?
shop, yeah, like they were selling bikes, ice cream, like they were, yeah, and then. God, everybody around the world knows Warner Brothers. That's
what an inspiration, though. What an inspiration when you think about it. There's just a lot to be said with that. Okay, I've tried the bike shop. I've tried the bowling alley. Maybe an ice cream shop.
Right.
Then all of a sudden you finally hit that one. We got to get the sound on the movies. We got to work on that. How are we going to figure that out? And then the next thing you know, it's just off to the races. Now, did he do some of that research here? Did he have like a laboratory or
Well, what happened was, they started out showing films around here. So that was the first thing. They had a copy of The Great Train Robbery, which you can go on YouTube and watch. It's an early like narrative film. Yeah. And they didn't even have a theater. They were just going around to like places like a butcher shop in Niles and Warren and Youngstown, just showing films, showing them at outdoor festivals, used to make a few bucks. And then they decided they wanted to have their own theater. And they didn't open one in Youngstown because there was too much competition. So they opened the first Warner Brothers theater in Newcastle because there was no Nickelodeon theaters out there. And they didn't even have chairs. There was a mortician down the street, the guy that had a funeral home, and they would borrow his chairs when there wasn't a funeral. And that was the first Warner theater. And then later they get into distributing films. Then they move out to California and they start their own studio. But it's not a big studio. What really breaks them through is the sound idea. When other people were like, nobody wants to hear sound pictures. Like nobody wants to hear actors talk. Today we just think it's natural, but people thought, oh no, there's an artistry. You tell the story and nobody has to talk. But Sam Warner was totally right, and they got in on the ground floor, and it just boom. It changed everything.
Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. It all starts right here in downtown Youngstown.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they literally lived right down West Federal Street, just like a 5-minute walk from where we are.
Craziness.
Yeah, crazy.
Well, listen, Sean, we're about out of time.
Sure, yeah. Hey,
that flew by. I don't know if it went by as fast for you, but I'll tell you what, man, you're a great interviewer, great interviewee, I guess, and just so many stories. We'll have to have you come back.
Oh yeah,
especially when the book comes back.
Sure.
And we ran out of time. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Spanish flu because I know you wrote a big article about that and you did some research on that.
Yes.
And because with we got a couple more minutes. Why don't you tell us, because I think that's so timely here.
Sure.
And why don't you tell us a little bit about what Youngstown was like when the Spanish flu hit?
Right. So people can look this up. Now, the article that'll appear in the book is going to be different because I've since changed it. But when the pandemic started, it must have been in March or early April, a friend of mine was like, wow, he's like, there hasn't been anything like this since the Spanish flu. I wonder if somebody should write something about like the Spanish flu in Youngstown. I was like, I'm like, that's a great idea.
Ding, ding, ding. Here's my man. I'm down on it.
Let me see if I can find the information. And I did. I found enough to do it. So, I juxtaposed like downtown Youngstown in April when it was just, the lockdown and there was nobody around. And I went back to 1918 when they locked downtown Youngstown down. And I compared it a little bit. I talked about the Spanish flu and people wearing masks and, they closed South High School and turned it into a hospital. And I found an oral history that survives of a guy who was a high school kid. And many of the nurses in Youngstown were in Europe because World War I was still on or was just ending. So this high school kid, they're like, kid, you got to help us take care of these people. And he's just talking about how he's in South High and just people are dying all around him. And he's like, helping the doctors treat people, burying people, wrapping the bodies up and everything.
Oh, man.
I mean, it was serious business. A lot of people died. I mean, every day in the Vindicator, they printed like the deaths from the Spanish flu, the people's names, whole families wiped out.
Wow.
Parents, kids whose parents died. And, amazingly, a lot of kids, both their parents died, and then people adopted them. Sometimes people they weren't even related to just like took them in. Like it was just something you did. Like, okay, we're just taking this kid in.
Yeah, somebody's got to watch him. He needs somewhere to go. What
Yeah,
a
I mean,
crazy time.
It sounded like it was totally crazy. And then at the end of it, while it was ending, there was a huge crime spree in the city where all these street criminals decided, man, there's total chaos everywhere. Now's the time to go on like a crime spree. So the city is like, the cops are, chasing these street criminals around. People are dying. Everything's closed. The movie theaters are shuttered. It's just, it sounded like it was a really crazy thing.
Amazing stuff. Amazing stuff. Can't wait to see your new book come out.
Hey,
when do you think
thanks.
you're going to have it?
It should be out by the end of the year.
Okay. And where can people find your book, Lost Youngstown, your movie theater book? Do you have a website, Facebook, or where could they get in touch with you?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the booksellers online, Barnes & Noble here in the city. A lot of local shops carry it too. So you do a quick search, you'll be able to find it pretty easy.
Awesome. I don't even know why I asked that anymore. Well, there's still some people out there. Hey, where could you get the guy's book?
Sure, right.
I would just Google your name and I would find everything that I need to know. All right. Hey, Sean, thanks for stopping by.
Thanks for having me.
Interesting conversation. I know our listeners just love to hear about the history of Youngstown. And boy, I think we touched on a lot of really cool stuff. So get his book. It's called Lost Youngstown. Sean Posey. Look him up online. You'll find the book out there somewhere. The movie theater book is another good one. Check out his website and watch for his new book coming out soon.
Thanks.
Sean, thank you, man.
Appreciate
Thanks for stopping by.
Thank you for listening to this show on Youngstown Studio. If you like our programming, we invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow our Facebook page, or subscribe to your favorite podcast platform like iTunes or Spotify. This is original Youngstown content, and we would appreciate you sharing the videos and the word about us. Thank you.